Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back today. We got somebody I'm excited to talk with, Professor Steve Keen. How you doing?
Well, I gave you the frank answer a short while ago. I'll keep that from the audience, but
Uh,
let's say I'm alive,
yeah,
if
a
not
lot.
kicking.
I'm still breathing. He's
Still
still breathing,
breathing. Yeah,
folks.
it's a challenge these days.
Of course, you're economist, Australian post-Keynesian economist. We'll get into that. Your some of your works are debunking economics. Can we avoid another financial crisis? The new economics, and rewriting economics from scratch. Is that just about do it?
That's pretty much it. I'm just about to release a new book. It should actually be up on Kindle tomorrow, and that has the title, and it's a long one: Money and Macroeconomics from First Principles for Elon Musk and Other Engineers. So I took him at his word that he's an engineer, and I wrote a book which has a lot of equations in it, and we'll see whether he gets to read it or not. But it basically says, Elon, you're the person who claims we should always work for first principles, and how you're approaching your arguments for that. The government, by analogy, saying the government's like a household. Well, if you designed your rockets the same way, you would never have. SpaceX would be spaced out.
Yeah, yeah. It's amazing what he thinks, and I don't think anybody's listening to experts anyway anymore. It's only fringe economists who are being taken seriously,
I wish
and
that were true. Sorry, the mainstream is still being taken seriously, because if you look at how everybody thinks about government debt, government spending, and how they ignore private debt, that's all stuff you can get straight out of first-year economics textbooks. And I think, in fact, that's the problem. People go and do a PPE degree, politics, philosophy, and economics in the UK. They do Economics 101 at the university. They get a first-year textbook version of the world. It's complete garbage. The economists themselves don't know it, because it's part of their religion to believe what's in that book. But yeah, that's where the errors are coming from. So they're listening to the wrong people who think they're experts, which is mainstream economists, and they're not.
yeah, and making false assumptions about human nature. This the classic Milton Friedman thing, and
Mm.
these kind of guys. But even Keynes, who is liberal in some sense, where they still wanted some social welfare state, but still wildly archaic kind of economic theory, right?
Well, Milton Friedman, definitely. It's economics. It's unfortunately, economics today is like astronomy 500 years ago. It defines your view of the world. So if you believe that the world is perfectly designed by God, and here we are, Earth at the center of the universe, fixed and immovable, and everything is orbiting around us, and somebody comes and says, "Hey, I've invented this thing for the telescope. You want to take a look?" Reaction of religious people is, get that thing away from me. I don't want to
Yeah,
see.
I know.
I'd rather just believe. And so that's really the state of economics. And I find it incredibly frustrating, because it's worse than shooting fish in a barrel when I
Mm.
try to show why the neoclassicals are wrong about the economy. But they won't listen. They just refuse to listen to anything that's not part of their religion. And in that sense, I know what Galileo felt like when he had, proof that the theory that they all believed in was wrong. Now, there's moons around orbiting Jupiter, which aren't supposed to happen in the Ptolemaic system. And he couldn't get any of his local professors to look down the telescope, because they knew he must be wrong, because, hey, it's in the Bible.
Yeah. Semmelweis, the same thing. He was trying to tell people to wash their hands when they were
Yeah,
delivering babies, and you know, would
yeah.
have gone a long way.
Mm.
And they live with the paper bag over their heads about it, mainly probably to make sure that the status quo is, you know, neoliberalism has created the wealth inequality that we have today.
It certainly amplified it. And wealth inequality is a natural thing of virtually any, not natural, but it's a structural outcome of virtually any type of a human society. But we've got it on steroids now, courtesy of neoliberalism. And in many ways, it's telling us the exact opposite of what we should do to keep the system intact.
Yeah, and we could have we. And what do you think about the Chinese system right now? How are they doing? Obviously, I'm a fan. I think they're leaders. Like no organized society has it right, and economics, like you say, is a guessing
Mm.
game
Yeah.
dressed up as a science when it's really really more like a religion. What do you think the Chinese are accomplishing over there? What's your take?
Well, step one, they're run by engineers, not economists. And that means you might make some, well, it means that you basically, as Musk claims to do, think from first principles about things, and you want to build stuff. And that's the orientation of the Chinese. They're not worried about a government deficit. They run quite a substantial one each year. They have 5-year plans that have got spending. Spending is the thing they worry about. Taxing it back is not quite secondary, but they're not obsessed about balancing the budget. They're obsessed about building this society. And with a combination of the government deficits, export surplus, they've industrialized at a ludicrous rate. And most people simply aren't aware of how fast China has grown. Its rate of growth is slowing down now, but it's still about 2 or 3 times the annual rate of economic growth per capita in America. And when you look over the last 40 years, from 1980 to 2025, thereabouts, China's per capita rate of economic growth every year has been over 8%. America has been about 1.7%. What that means is China doubles its per capita income in less than a decade. And so 4 decades, 2, 4, 8, 16 times. America doubles every 40 years. So it's barely got to the stage where it's got double the per capita income that it had back in 1980. And of course, the distribution of the income has been skewed massively towards the wealthy, away from the middle class and the poor. So China's been very careful not to leave their poor people in that situation, partly because of their ideology. It's pretty hard to screw the working class when you claim to be a working class party. Much easier to screw the working class when you claim to be the party of the free enterprise, etc., etc. But it's also because you don't want to see the Chinese people revolt. I've actually witnessed a demonstration in China in 1981, way back. And this is a little anecdote, but I took a bunch of Australian journalists for a conference in China with Chinese journalists, quite a fascinating experience. But it happened to coincide with the annual women's volleyball. Exciting, eh? Women's volleyball competition. And the final is China versus Japan. Now, at that stage, they've got over the rape of Nanking and so on to that nature to some extent, and they cooperate with the Chinese, with the Japanese. And Deng Xiaoping's decision to go for high-speed rail and things like that actually came out of a trip and being amazed by the technology he saw in Japan, taking it back over there. Nonetheless, at that time, the animosity was huge. And the Communist Party said, under no circumstances shall there be a demonstration in Tiananmen Square if the Chinese women win the contest. Well, the Chinese women won the contest. And we guessed, I had a bunch of journalists with me, we guessed between 300,000 and 500,000 Chinese people were in that square, absolutely cock-a-hoop happy, rioting effectively, afraid of what might happen from the outside, but nonetheless, they're willing to do a riot in that sense. So that realization that the Chinese, top level of the party know themselves from their own experiences being governors in provinces and so on. You don't want to get the Chinese people angry. So there's been a strong emphasis, we've got to bring the whole society up. They had 40 years of failure, not really total failure under Mao, but they got rid of the landlords and democratized ownership of land, not everything else in the system.
Yeah.
So there was progress in that sense, but the Great Leap Forward was a catastrophe. Killing all the sparrows was a catastrophe. All these sorts of crazy things that happened under Mao, and they basically said no more of that. We're going to the objective is pragmatism fundamentally. So that classic statement from Deng Xiaoping: it doesn't matter whether the cat's black or white, as long as it catches mice. That's been the basic organizing principle, rather than we need to balance the books, which is what's taken over the West.
And at the same time, more long-term focus rather than short-term focus like we do. And so it's somehow still strategic in that way, where they do what's pragmatic, but at the same time they see, okay, this works, but for how long? And then to put state-sponsored capitalism and say, well, we're going to focus on what we know is scientifically proven to be important, rather than they banned Bitcoin and now you see the United States embracing it wholeheartedly because it's a Ponzi scheme, and we love Ponzi schemes out west.
Absolutely, yeah. Yeah.
So let's get into the written questions. You said you're starting from scratch to explain macroeconomics, presumably because mainstream teaching has failed us. What foundational economic misunderstandings do you think are most dangerous right now, especially in light of the climate crisis?
Well, the most important one, without a doubt, is the belief that the government has to balance its books. because that's what all of we have to do. You and I, have to at least balance our books. We're better off spending. We want to earn more income than we spend, and if we don't do that, we end up in bankruptcy. And then, by analogy, people like Musk and politicians and economists across the planet say government's just like a household; it's got to do the same thing. The reality is the government creates money by spending more than it takes back in taxation. That's how you create fiat money. So what we've had instead is a leaders who don't understand how money is created, and they believe the government's in the same situation as households. If you create money as a household, you'll end up in jail for forgery. Okay? But if you create money as the government, that's part of being a government. It's not getting the roles right. And what I've been doing is building software that lets me prove that, not just assert it, but prove it with mathematical models. That's called Ravel. So that's the most important, I think, dilemma. I see we're destroying our capacity to create non-financial assets, houses, roads, high-speed rail, yada, 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 by obsessing about financial assets. And this is this is like the Ponzi scheme mentality of the West. I think one reason China is doing so much better, their 5-year plans have objectives to achieve various types of non-financial assets in 5 years' time, such as high-speed rail across the whole country, taking places out of desert, etc., etc. So that's the important thing. Forget about this obsession about the government deficit. You need one to create fiat money. That then leads into the climate issue, because there's no way the private financial sector is going to finance trying to attenuate the damage from climate change. When, and it's not a question of if anymore, it's when that starts to destroy productive capacity on a grand scale, the private financial system is likely to collapse. And the only way we're going to be able to muster the resources to try to attempt to do something to avoid having our entire societies destroyed by climate change is going to be government spending. And that's what happened during World War II. We didn't fight World War II by borrowing money from Rothschild to fight for the Germans. The government just spent the money, created it by fiat, and that's why America built so many Liberty ships during World War II, and they went from having virtually no vessels to being the biggest navy in the world over that period of time, all financed by government money creation. We need the same sort of thing to fight climate change, but at the moment, the people in charge, A, don't believe it's happening, which is moronic. Okay, and B, don't know that they can actually create the money in the first place to build the resources to fight it. So that combination of two factors, the ignorance about money creation and stupidity about global warming.
And I see Wall Street Journal outlets like this in the West, or The Economist, will run stories that say, oh, this Chinese firm or this Chinese, financial firm or whatever lost this amount or whatever, or a corporation in China that lost some quarterly earnings, or was because they spent a lot of money in developing something new, instead of like in the West, where corporations don't even innovate anymore. They simply rest on their laurels and buy back their stock. I don't think it's sustainable what's happening.
Not in the West. No, it's a recipe for disaster. And every time you slash spending, you're slashing creation of new physical resources. You end up with a weaker physical system, because you're trying to save the financial system that doesn't need saving, because the government doesn't borrow from the public, as we put the model for it. It creates the money. And so that stupidity is leading us to basically, we're asset stripping our societies as we approach a crisis in which, if we don't have the assets, there will be no society left.
Private equity is coming in and buying the Greyhound bus system and the Red Lobster, and just stripping away all the assets and then leaving it barren. And that'll be that. So manufacturing in China is about 30%. In Germany, it's about 20%. In the United States, it's 10%. But out of all of the 10%, most of that is dependent on foreign labor and foreign imported goods, like electronic pieces or whatever that they have to do. What are they going to do as far as manufacturing? Are they just really going to wait to the last minute until everybody's eating different, squirrels and cats, or what's going to happen?
Yeah, I mean, the ignorance about the role of manufacturing in a society is another breathtaking mistake of mainstream economics. They basically, so you maximize your utilities there. They're guiding light, not maximize your productive capability. And if any And this is something. It's almost like a cycle of empires. That if you become the empire, you often become the empire because you've built a huge advantage over other people in manufacturing, and therefore not only do you produce goods and services, you can also produce weapons and use those to invade the rest of the world. Then you become the reserve currency, so your currency becomes much more expensive, and it's therefore becomes cheaper to produce goods in the other countries. So you start running a deficit, and you're running down your manufacturing sector, and you think that's great because people are working for you in other countries, and you're just absorbing the largesse. Keep it going for long enough, your manufacturing declines to the stage where you can't make the weapons anymore. Some other empire comes along and makes the weapons better than you do. They take over, and then they make the same mistake of becoming the reserve currency, and on you go. So you can look at the British, same story, that the pound became the reserve currency, massively overvalued pound because you needed the pound for everything. British manufacturing rose from virtually zero to 35% of America, of the global manufacturing in the early 1800s, and then from the stage of the dominance the empire had, down from 35% to about less than 10% now. America comes along, industrializes, particularly World War II plays a major role, end up being the strongest manufacturing power at the end of the war. Same story, they make the mistake of becoming, what the fuck happened then? Hello? I've just gone blank. What happened? Are you
I'm
there?
still here. Yeah.
Yeah, my system just went blank for a moment. Pardon me. No idea why. Okay, back to the previous brain fart. Okay, so you have America after World War II, major manufacturing company, makes the mistake of declaring itself the reserve currency. That's the Bretton Woods Agreement. Keynes wanted not to have a national currency. He wanted to break that imperial cycle. Americans insisted upon it. They become the reserve currency. Currency gets massively overvalued. Over time, they lose competitiveness to the rest of the world. The manufacturing sector falls as a proportion of GDP. They think they're making great progress out of being the reserve currency because they can buy anything in the rest of the world with American dollars, which they produce virtually for free. And bang, guess who reverses on the now? It's China. So hopefully China won't make the mistake of declaring the renminbi to be the reserve currency for the planet. Hopefully they'll decide when they become dominant, as that's inevitable, the current rate of economic growth, that we use something like Keynes's idea of the Bancor for international trade. And if we do that, you won't get the Chinese currency being overvalued by the fact you need it for trade, and they can maintain the competitive advantage. But at the moment, they've done, it's just crazy watching America destroy itself.
Yeah.
While financialization, you're financializing a system, turning everything into financial, everything into a Ponzi scheme. You end up producing nothing, not knowing how to produce anything, and you end up, the dumb relics. And Britain got itself into that situation over the 18th and 19th and 20th centuries. America's done it in the 20th and 21st.
Yeah. If China can avoid it, that'd be good. But who knows? Maybe on the horizon we'll have BRICS bucks.
Well, they're part of the BRICS. That's the C in the BRICS. I wonder why. One thing that throws me, BRICS. That's a stupid name. Why didn't they call it? Why didn't they call it Cribs?
There you go.
Okay, exactly the same initials. Okay, and Cribs implies babies that are going to grow. So I think
maybe these giant superpower countries don't see themselves as infants as much. But yeah.
Well, yeah. Anyway, when it was joined, they still regarded China as an infinite, but that was when it was 1/4 the size it is now.
Yeah, and the population growth was incredible. And speaking of Mao, yeah, he did all these terrible things, but he did, get the literacy rate up, and he doubled the life expectancy of the people. So,
yeah,
say what you will.
I saw a wonderful play way back in my youth called Fan Shen, and apparently that's Mandarin for transform. And it was a little play about what the Communist Party did to transform the country from a fundamentally feudal society, which had been raped by the Europe Westerners under the Opium Wars. I mean, most people think Opium Wars, China must have imposed opium on the rest of the world. Not an effing chance. The British imposed opium upon China and then fought to maintain the right. So they know they were destroyed in the 19th century by outrageous behavior by the colonial powers. Now they've just, the complete reversal of all that has occurred. So I've sort of lost my train of thought there.
You're a rare gem. You're an economist that actually knows history. That's impressive.
Yeah, I never learned history at school or university, but I read voraciously, so that's given me the historical background.
Hey, yeah, I'm with you there. I love to learn. So you recently referenced Kim Stanley Robinson's Ministry for the Future and the
Mm.
looming threat of wet bulb heat events. So how do this is something I really care about. Is that traditional economic models really well? They always fail to some degree, but
Yeah,
they really fail to account for these existential threats and sort of the domino effects that can happen from that. So
yeah.
where are we at with that?
5 minutes from midnight would be probably the best way to describe it. And unlike the usual nuclear clock, this is just going in one direction. The reason economists don't worry about things like wet bulb temperature and so on is they developed the specialization of climate change economics in a response to the limits to growth. It was all there because the limits to growth said there are limits to growth.
Yeah.
Neoclassical economists think growth can go on forever on a finite planet. I've actually found there's a guy called Daniel Susskind, who's a academic economist at King's College in London. He literally wrote that in one of his books I was asked to referee or to read. So if you can have infinite growth on a finite planet, quote unquote. That is loony bin material. But when the limits growth said that wasn't true, they dived in and said, yes, it can happen. And so fundamentally, they believe that capitalism can handle any shock. That's this idea of capitalism is an incredibly robust system. So if you say that there's something which is going to destroy capitalism, well, that's got to be wrong. Okay, so they went and sort of did the cuckoo thing, chucked the limits to growth egg out of the nest, planted their own one in there, and they changed the modelling approach the limits to growth used, which was all based on physical feedbacks, and to put in these models they call integrated assessment models. But what people don't realise is that you think that economists would be taking the results of climate scientists, because they're the people who know the climate, and then putting an economic value on them. In fact, they made up their own model of the climate. That's what DICE was first done on. They only included temperature inside there. They don't have any precipitation effects in their models, even today. Okay, they've had 40 years to bring in precipitation into it. Wind, none of the stuff that we know actually causes crises is even in their models of the climate that they wrote when they're not specialists, not experts on the climate. But they then had to calibrate these models. And what did they do? They pretended, and I'm not joking, that a roof will protect you from climate change. Okay? So if you're exposed to the weather, climate change will affect you. Not exposed to the weather, climate change won't affect you. Literally, that's stupid. And like this was first done by Nordhaus in 1991, and he broke American industry into three categories: significantly exposed to climate change, moderately exposed, and negligibly exposed. He put 87% of the economy in negligibly exposed, and that included mining. Okay. Now, somebody must have tapped him on the shoulder and said, William, there is open cut mining, that's exposed to the weather. So a later paper says 85% and says underground mining. It's that stupid. I mean, this stuff is so bad. If I had a kid of primary school age who wrote garbage like they wrote, I wouldn't let him leave home till he's chained to the essay. Okay, and they give the Nobel Prize to this guy instead, not because he knows what he's talking about, but because he defends the neoclassical paradigm. And so what has happened is we've lived a fantasy world where we've accepted the economist estimates of damages, and the worst damage estimate economists have made in any of their papers is that to be a 19% fall in GDP by 2050. Okay. Now that looks like a large number, 19% smaller. What it says is GDP in 2050 will be 19% smaller than it would be if there was no climate change. So it's two hypothetical numbers they're comparing. When you work it out in terms of a rate of growth between now and 2050, which is 25 years away, that 19% fall in GDP, those two hypothetical numbers in 2050, translates into a prediction of a 0.8% fall in the annual rate of economic growth. In other words, they still don't see any, like average economic growth globally is about 3%. Their side's going to be 2.2%. That's still positive growth. And that's right out the worst I've ever, the craziest I've seen was a survey of economists where they surveyed everybody who published on climate change in an economic journal, about 2,200 people. And about 380 answered this particular question. And they were asked, what's going to be the impact of 7 degrees of warming in 2 centuries' time, so 2220? They said it'd be 20% smaller. Now, when you work that into what does that mean in terms of a change in the rate of growth, that's say economic growth on a trajectory towards 7 degrees warmer than we are now is going to be 0.14% lower. So rather than growing at 3%, we're going to grow at 2.86%. 7 degrees, we'll be fucking extinct. Okay, if you talk to the climate scientists, and you know things like Kim Stanley Robinson's wet bulb temperature and so on, 7 degrees of warming, that's goodbye probably most mammalian species on the planet.
Yeah.
And
Temperature is rising, and at the same time, their predictions say, well, we'll just become more and more productive as things fall apart. This is ludicrous. This reminds me of that movie Don't Look Up, where there's an asteroid coming towards Earth, and the best thing they could do is we should mine it for minerals before it kills us. But then what are we going to do with the minerals?
Yeah.
No idea. Yeah. So you've highlighted works like Graziani's monetary theory of production and Wegg's paradox of debt. Now, what roles should public debt and endogenous money creation play in reshaping the economy? And why are these concepts still taboo in mainstream discourse?
Largely because the mainstream has a barter-based model of economy. So if you read any mainstream textbook right up to Milton Friedman, their explanation for the existence of money is that it gets around the problem of the double coincidence of wants in barter. So if you have two people bartering, one's got to want what the other one's selling. But if you have money, they can go through an intermediate product and then they can make a transaction that way. That's the entire explanation they have for money in their models. And their models of macroeconomics don't include banks or debt or money, okay, because they say it's just making barter easier. This is a complete myth. Capitalism is a monetary system. It's a monetary system where the money enables you to produce the physical goods that make the physical capital of the economy. So if you don't understand money creation, you don't understand capitalism, and that rules out neoclassical economists immediately. But then there's a question, how do you handle it? And that's where Graziani's work was so important, because he said, what's the difference between a monetary economy and a barter economy? And he said, a barter economy can't be using a commodity, because that's just like singling out one commodity and calling it money. It's still basically a barter system. It said credit, it can't be based on credit, because credit involves like an IOU. If you buy something using an IOU, there's still a relationship between you and the seller until such time as you fulfill the IOU. So he finally said the only way you can have a monetary system is money is actually based on promises. The bank promises that they'll give you the money in your bank account. For you or the buyer, the same thing for the seller. You then if you buy something, you transfer the promises to pay of the bank to you across to the promises to pay of the bank for the seller, and then the bank gives you the goods, and that's the complete end of the transaction. So that gave me the idea that in Graziani's concept, all transactions are triangular. So the barter model of neoclassical economics has a buyer with a particular good to flog, a buyer-seller, okay? And then on the other side, you've got a seller-buyer, and they work out a ratio of the two, and that's the end of it. So it's two people and two commodities and no money. What Graziani said is a buyer with money, there's a seller with a product. They both have a bank account. They transfer the money from one bank account to another, and that's how the sale actually occurs. And therefore, all transactions are triangular, involving a buyer, a seller, and a bank. And that was the vision that let me create Ravel, which is the software package that I think the world desperately needs to get hold of, because all the myths about money can be completely dispelled by using double entry bookkeeping and seeing how the system functions. And that's what Ravel does.
What's the name of that again?
It's called Ravel, Ravel. And at the moment, we're distributing it very cheaply through Patreon. So we're currently trying to build an actual commercial vehicle for it right now, myself and my programming partner. But you can find it at patreon.com/Ravelation, so Ravel, Ravelation. So think revelation with an A.
Very cool. I didn't know that you were creating wonderful things like that. We'll have to talk more about that. So your manifesto advocates for macroeconomic framework grounded in real-world money flows and debt dynamics. Now, how can policymakers realistically implement these ideas within the constraints of the existing financial systems that are currently on fire?
Easily, because I described the current financial system. What they've got in their heads is a myth. And the myth is that banks are what they call intermediaries. They gave bloody Ben Bernanke the Nobel Prize for this garbage in 2022. Okay, so his paper they gave him a prize for presumed that banks were just intermediaries who don't actually lend money. They enable savers to lend to borrowers. So in that case, therefore, the debt that's taken on by a borrower is an asset of the saver, not an asset of the bank. And then the transfer of money from the buyer to the seller doesn't involve from the lender to the borrower doesn't involve any creation of money because the saver's account goes down, the borrower's account goes up. There's no creation of money coming out of that. When you look in the real world, banks lend and they create money when they lend. The bank lending creates deposits, and that's a quote from the Bank of England in 2014. So when you include that in the real world, in the models of the economy, and say it's actually banks that create money when they lend, then you get a completely different vision of how the economy operates. And credit matters. Credit's important. The rate of change of private debt is a vital factor for understanding your economy, whereas neoclassical economists ignore it. And I can show that if you want to take a look, I can show you the physical data. That's what caused the global financial crisis. Credit going from plus 15% of GDP in 2006 to minus 5% in 2009. Neoclassical economists don't even look at that because, according to their a prioris, credit plays no role in macroeconomics. So I'm just saying, if we understand the system properly, we've already got the structures in place to be able to manage it properly. It's the mismanagement by people who simply don't understand the system they've been put in control of.
Yeah, and old outdated ideas, and
Yeah,
that most human beings are ideologues to some degree. Um,
unfortunately.
but that brings me to my final question. You were pretty good about predicting the crash in 2008.
Yeah,
Um, Amazing kind of unpacking how that came to be, tracing it
yeah.
all the way back to 1980, and the you know the mortgage bond was invented and stuff. How did your models forecast the crisis, and everybody else failed to see it coming, and what
Uh,
lessons did you learn from that?
Well, it was actually quite a surprise to me because I wanted to model Minsky's financial instability hypothesis. That was my choice of a PhD topic. And I knew that Minsky himself had tried to do the same thing and he chose the wrong model foundation. I knew the model was mathematically false. So I built a model, taking a cyclical model of the economy and adding private debt to it. So what I argued in the model is that the model I took assumed that capitalists invest all their profits. I simply added that capitalists invest more than their profits during a boom and less than their profits during a slump, and they borrow money to make up the difference. And that's where credit plays a role in aggregate demand and income and expands economic activity. Lo and behold, when I first simulated the model, this is back in August of 1992, the model led to a debt crisis as I expected it would, given various parameter values. But when you had a crisis, the cycles got smaller for a while and then got larger. Now, this is in 1992. By 1995 or 98, I think, the pattern of declining cycles in the economy, smaller busts and smaller booms, but more stable economic growth. That had become so prominent that neoclassical economists they call it the Great Moderation, and they patted themselves on the back for it. I saw it and thought, holy shit, my model's turning up in the data. So I took a look at the data, and what I saw was the rising level of private debt to GDP. And in America's case, private debt to GDP in 1945 was about 50% of GDP. By the time I look at the data again, after doing my PhD on it, this is in 2005, and I saw that private debt was 150% of GDP. I said, this trend can't continue. When the rate of growth of private debt slows down, that will cause the economy to slow down. And when it does, it's likely the credit's going to go negative, and that'll then drive the economy down. That's precisely what happened. Now, the mainstream don't even look at it because by their a prioris, and this is quoting Ben Bernanke yet again, they said, absent implausibly large differences in marginal propensities to spend between the savers and the borrowers, pure redistributions, which is what they think lending is, should have no significant macroeconomic effects. So they don't even look at the data. They collect it, but they don't look at it because it doesn't fit inside their paradigm. When I take a look at the relationship between credit, which is the change in private debt per year, and unemployment in America across the financial crisis between 1990 and 2015, I find a correlation of minus 0.93. Now, that's a slightly different to zero. Okay. And they don't even look at the data because it doesn't fit their paradigm.
Are they just scared of the how complex to calculate these variables, or is it really more, malevolent, where they're looking out for, capitalist interests more so?
It is just the ignorance of people who believe in a paradigm and can't change their minds. And this is a common human phenomenon. You can
Right.
find it in physics as well. So Max Planck, who's one of the greatest physicists of all time, he's the one who solved what's called the black body radiation problem, because according to Maxwell's theory of electromagnetic radiation, if you have what's called a black box, a thing which just emits radiation but is black. The profile of the radiation coming out of that looked like a pimple, up and then down. Now we know that these days, courtesy of Max Planck, that's because of the inherent frequency of the black box. There's a particular level of photon that comes out. That's the profile. But when you try to fit that to that phenomenon to the Maxwellian theory, it fitted one side of the pimple, but then it predicted what's called the ultraviolet catastrophe, infinite levels of ultraviolet radiation coming out of the black box, which didn't happen. So Max Planck solved it. He did it using what's called integration in the complex plane. As part of that, that meant he actually ended up having a quanta, this very, very tiny number, 10 to the minus 37. I've forgotten the actual units of it, but a trivially a small number. But it said energy comes in small packets called quanta. Now that he could then fit that profile perfectly. And he tried to persuade his fellow Maxwellian scientists, and he said, not one of them. He said, it's the greatest disappointment of my life that I have never managed to convince anybody who believed this stuff to change their mind. He said, the way that new ideas become adopted in science is the old people die, and the new generation comes through is excited by the new paradigm. So that's a general human phenomenon, particularly of intellectual disciplines. The problem with economics is that it's neoclassical economics basically tells you that capitalism is a wonderful anarchist system.
Yeah.
Okay? It's an anarchist ideal world. No power. You get your utility maximized. There's there's no external force to direct you. The market reaches equilibrium. All these things are selling effectively a really attractive vision of an anarchist utopia. And that's what sucks economists in. And they can hang on to that vision even during something like the global financial crisis or the Great Depression. So there'll always be somebody, and often it's the majority, in the audience of a lecturer on economics who falls for the vision and sticks with it, even though the world's falling apart around them. So that's the one the professor chooses to replace him or herself. And that you don't get the generational change in economics that we get in real sciences. And that's the reason why economics hasn't progressed.
And real science isn't, they also have their issues with ideologues and politics and stuff,
Yeah.
where you can't get, I just saw this thing. It said, headline said, chewing gum can make you smarter. And then the study says, and I go to the bottom of the article, and it was founded by the Institute for, better chewing gum, the Wrigley Institute, basically.
Yeah.
It's really hard. So considering that this is human nature, and that we can't even grapple with the logic that's in front of our faces. Do you think we're going extinct?
Yes. With the scale, I mean, there's people just have no idea of the scale of what climate change means. And partly the same ignorance that people in the public have about it is shared by the economists. So people say, oh, you're talking 2 or 3 degrees. It changes 2 or 3 degrees in a couple of hours outside. Why should I worry about 2 or 3 degrees? The thing is, it's like increasing the temperature. This is an analogy, but I'll stick with it. Increasing the temperature of a soup container on a stove. And if you've all seen what they're called, Bernoulli. cycle. So you get bubbles coming up and bubbles going down. Turn the temperature up a few degrees and that'll break down. And that means that you get, bubbling over the whole surface rather than just in nice defined cycles. Well, we live on a planet which is cycling between our current temperature minus 1.5 degrees and 6 degrees cooler, and what are called Milankovitch cycles. That's we're in a glacial period. There's then an interglacial, then another glacial period, and so on. That's been happening all the way through. So 6 degrees of warming is the difference between ice sheets hitting New York and the sort of world we live in now. So that's partly it. But if you increase the temperature enough, and this is a substantial increase, like 4 or 5 degrees, but that's still, some mathematical models are saying this is feasible, push the temperature up that much, and the 3 circulation patterns we currently have in each hemisphere, the Hadley cell, the Ferrel cell, and the polar cell. So there's rising air at the equator, falling at 30, and then on through the other 2. So that can break down into one cell. Now, if that happens, means that you get alligators in the Arctic Circle, okay. But what it means is the pattern of rainfall and etc. we relied upon is destroyed.
Yeah.
And this is the thing, people don't realize a few degrees of temperature is enough to destroy the patterns on which we've based our entire civilization. And if that happens, and the levels at which the disasters like this can happen are a lot lower than scientists used to think. So 15 years ago, the first paper to survey expectations of scientists on what temperature was necessary to cause various tipping points to go said that what's called the Atlantic meridional overturning circulation, which people colloquially know as a Gulf Stream, so that would take 3 to 5 degrees to flip. Latest research said it's between 1.2 and 3 degrees. Now we're already at 1.5. So if the Atlantic meridional overturning circulation flips out, and again, latest research says that could happen over 3 decades, and over a 3-decade period, with the AMOC turned off, temperatures in Europe would fall by 9 degrees. Fall, yeah, because the Gulf Stream and the AMOC transfer about 10 degrees of warmth. Okay, from the southern of the country, the hemisphere, to the northern. If that turns off, it redistributes heat around the whole planet, of course.
Sure.
But you would have basically Europe become unlivable. Now that's what we're toying with, and the most recent papers, and I read the science papers, as you can tell. I don't write them. I'm not a scientist, but I can read them. They're saying that whereas the original estimation back in 2008 was this might take to 2200, 2300, they're now saying their mathematical model anytime between 2025 and 2095.
Yeah.
Now, if that happens, you can say 2030, then by 2040, you can't live in Europe anymore.
Yeah. The other thing is the modeling and the papers that are coming around centered around predictions in collapse, predictions in biodiversity loss and stuff are found to be too, liberal. They're not
too conservative.
They're too conservative. Sorry.
Yeah.
They're a little under, and so we're behind on all of these models. So then how are we not supposed to panic?
Exactly. And this is the, some of the billionaires are panicking and thinking they can build bunkers to get away from it all.
But investing heavily into PR, into convincing other people to fight amongst yourselves while we try to make it right.
Like I think this has never happened in the history of the planet before, let alone human history.
It's exciting.
I would like to live in less exciting times.
Right.
The old Chinese curse, may you live in interesting times.
I envy the people that lived in medieval times who've, defecated in the buckets and poured it out their windows.
Now that is a problem. Okay, we're definitely improved over that. We should have stopped in the night. We could have stopped. We should have stabilized in the 1950s.
Yeah.
Because if you look back and see what the standard of living was for the average American, a single male breadwinner could earn enough income to buy a house and support a family with a non-wage earning wife and 3 or 4 kids. Now you look at it, and 2 millennials with no kids can barely afford to buy a house. They're terrified all the way through, and they're not having children because of it. So we've really stuffed up our society and the ecology.
Yeah, the price of housing has gone up 900% since 1970, and I think that even then in the 1950s, everything was good domestically, but still how much of that was predicated on blood, sweat from, imperialized other countries?
America wasn't particularly imperial at the time. You'd invaded the Philippines. Of course,
Well,
you'd massacred Mexico. Let's not forget that. So you'd
well,
done,
the
yeah.
50s were actually really active. They overthrew Iran, they overthrew
Oh,
Brazil, and they overthrew Jacobo Arbenz in the banana republics in
but
Guatemala.
they weren't making the money out of it that Britain was making out of India. Okay.
Oh, that's true.
That's the point. So they didn't have to do it. It's just the maliciousness of the American right wing mentality. We've got to make sure democracy rules, and anybody who wants to give workers more money must be a communist. So they overthrew so many democratic regimes and put in what they saw as pro-capitalist ones, and that's what's caused a huge part of the chaos of the last 50 years.
So essentially, we're stuck in between a past that's horribly bloody and terrible, and a future that doesn't look too great, and the present that's just unnerving.
Yeah, making us all anxious.
Well, at least I've got whiskey, and I've got.
I think I might go and stock up.
Yeah, there's always a place that has whiskey somewhere, so that's good.
Mm.
I'll make it another day. All right,
Okay.
Professor Steve Keen, wonderful to have you. Will you come back and do it again?
Absolutely, it's good fun to crack you, Chris.
Yeah,
Just push my, some of my where people can find my work. I've got a
hit them up.
fairly active YouTube channel these days, so that's Prof Steve Keen on YouTube. I've got a Patreon and a Substack site, and I'm now building a software package, Revelation. I hope that'll be a commercial success. That's always difficult to get into the entrepreneurial space, and yeah, and I'm running an online course, which is it's called. The marketing makes me wince a bit, but I must say the course is extremely good. The people doing it love it, and that's called SteveKeenFree.com.
SteveKeenFree.com. Okay,
Yep.
so people can check you out. Hey, we all got to do what we got to do to survive in this capitalist hellscape, don't we?
Indeed.
Stick around. I'm going to talk to you about your app, and we'll say goodbye to everybody.
Sure.
Take it easy, everybody. Thanks for coming.